When we ended in the last video, I was talking about how there's a lack of reciprocity between men and women, and so how women's independence is not recognized. It's just her dependence that's recognized, and how men's dependence is not recognized. So when it comes to thinking about the relationship between men and women and how that compares to other struggles, Beauvoir says that many other groups of people who have been oppressed, they've had some sort of uprising or revolution. So for example, the proletariat in Russia, or anti-colonial movements, or African Americans with the civil rights movement. And so de Beauvoir says that women really haven't had an uprising because they don't have solidarity amongst one another the way other groups of oppressed people do have solidarity and unity. And so de Beauvoir says that women have only been willing to be given what men have been willing to give them. So women have just kind of passively taken what men have been willing to actively give them. So some people might disagree with this, obviously, and it is interesting to think about this in relation to how things are today. But she says that unlike other groups of oppressed people, where there was a historical development or there was a moment in history that led to that other group's oppression, women have always been oppressed in relation to men, and women don't have their own community, they don't have their own history, they don't have their own culture. They are dispersed amongst men in the workplace, in the private sphere. So it is really difficult for women to have their own culture and uprising when they are dispersed amongst a group of people that they are oppressed by. And this is part of this weird situation where you can't have a division or a cleavage in society, as she says, based off of sex and gender, because these sexes and genders need to interact with one another in order perhaps to maintain the species and in order to just continue to exist in society. So you can't necessarily have a situation where women completely cut themselves off from men, because that would make things a lot more difficult when it comes to functioning and running a society, just in terms of evolution and propagating the species. She's not saying anything about how everyone must be heterosexual or anything like that. She's just talking about how the species maintains itself and how it's difficult for women to just completely run away and square and have their own community that's separate from men, because we all exist together in the same families and in workplaces. So how can women let go of these chains then? Well, we have to think about how women's conditions have changed over time and what can be done to improve those conditions. And so she says that there is kind of this distinction between abstract equality and concrete equality. So women have abstract equality. We have certain rights. We are protected under certain kinds of legislation. There are laws about equal pay. But when it comes to concrete situations, right, women are not treated equally, right? Think about the whole Me Too movement, sexual harassment. White women make about 80 cents for every dollar white men make. That number decreases to 65 cents for African American and Latinx women. So even though you have abstract equality, there are numerous situations and examples of concrete inequality that prevent women from truly being able to be free and transcend in this existentialist way. And so she talks also about how there are longstanding customs and habits and traditions in society that also prevent this concrete equality from occurring. So she gives the example of marriage. A woman is expected to take the man's name, and nowadays we see more women taking the man's name but still keeping their maiden name, but men are not expected to take the woman's name. So we still see this kind of inequality here. Or the man is still expected to be the one to propose and, propose from a ring that he bought at Jared. And so it's not as if women are expected to be the initiators. We also think about certain kinds of wedding ceremonies and how the father is supposed to walk the bride down the aisle and give his daughter away to another man, right? That notion of symbolism, because women used to technically be property in marriage. So we have these long-standing customs and traditions that kind of prevent this idea from real equality occurring. And also, she talks about how people can have an abstract idea of equality and say, oh, I have nothing wrong with women getting equal rights, or I'm totally fine with this group of people. But then when it comes to their own interactions with them, let's say something bad happened in that situation, well, then they can start to think in stereotypical ways about that person or about that group of people. So someone could say that they support a man, for example, could say he supports women's rights, but then he could get into a disagreement with a woman at work and then call her a bitch, or a woman at his job could get a promotion and then he feels like she only got the job because she's a woman and affirmative action or something. So those are just examples of how someone could abstractly believe in something, but then there are concrete situations where they don't necessarily uphold those same principles, which are barriers to equality in general, and specifically in this case of women. So de Beauvoir says that women are also to blame for their otherness or for their oppression. Like, unlike other groups of people that we talked about where there were specific revolutions and uprisings, women are integrally tied to men in the workplace, in the private sphere, etc. And so it makes it more difficult for them to completely cut themselves off from them. And she also says that women derive a type of satisfaction from being an other in society. More specifically, there can be benefits to aligning oneself with men in a patriarchal society. So if you're a woman and you live with a man, or you are walking outside with a man, right, you're told, okay, you're going to be safer if you're walking outside with a man, or two incomes are better than one, and so you're viewed as protected in marriage. So there are certain benefits to being in relation to men, which makes it difficult for women to completely engage in a revolution against men in society. And so that's why she says that the tie that binds her to her oppressors is unlike any other tie. And this is also why it's harder for women to say, you know what, I'm going to completely cut myself off when she perhaps gets benefits from her husband or her father or her boyfriend or whoever it is. So being able then to think about the situation of woman and woman's opportunities has to be done in a way where we're being honest and transparent about everything. And this is why at the end of the introduction, de Beauvoir says, I am going to be partial about this situation, meaning I'm not going to be objective about this. She says, I am a woman and I'm talking about women's condition. So of course, my perspective is going to be coming from a woman's perspective. And so there's nothing wrong with being partial or biased if you're upfront about it. And so she says the problem with a lot of philosophy is that a lot of these philosophers have been biased and have only been talking about their own experiences when in fact they've been pretending to be objective. So many philosophers have said, well, yes, I'm objective, I'm impartial, I'm speaking for the abstract human being, when in fact, they're only speaking from their lived experiences. And there's nothing wrong with coming from a male perspective, but don't pretend or assume that your perspective is universal and represents everyone, because it doesn't. And same thing with women. But de Beauvoir says it's better to state your biases from the start. We all have certain perspectives, we all have lived experiences, we all are raised in certain values, and so it's important to say, you know what, this is how I'm going to be biased about this. And she says that it's impossible to look at a human problem or human situation from an impartial or objective perspective. It's just impossible because we are human beings and we are mired in those relationships and those identities. So it's better to say, you know what, I'm a woman and I'm going to talk about feminism and I'm going to be biased about it from a woman's perspective. So that's her kind of theoretical transparency here. And she's also saying that she's coming from an existentialist perspective because she says that she doesn't care about woman's happiness. She's not assessing a woman's happiness. She's assessing a woman's facticity in terms of her transcendence. Can she go beyond the givens in life? Is she free? Because de Beauvoir says happiness is so subjective. She says, a woman in a harem could be happier than a woman voter. A woman who's a housewife could be happier than a career woman. So we're not really thinking about happiness because oftentimes we want to say someone's happy because we don't want to take any accountability for their oppression. But de Beauvoir says we need to really think about it through an existentialist lens in terms of facticity and transcendence and freedom. So can a woman truly transcend? We can measure freedom and opportunities a lot more easily, at least, than someone's happiness. So what opportunities are open to women in society in terms of work, in terms of hobbies, in terms of the private sphere? Can she walk alone without having to worry about getting raped? Can she go to a party without worrying that someone's going to put specific drugs in her drink and knock her out? Can she live in a society where she's paid as much as a man is paid for the same educational background and skills? So these are the things that she's thinking about and that she's assessing. And she concludes the second sex with this notion that, okay, we're going to understand woman in terms of her freedom rather than happiness. What is a woman's condition? What opportunities are open to her?